Blood dripped from the chandelier, pooling on the marble floor as the city's most lethal men held their breath. Regina smirked, waiting for the dawn to discard the soft, curvy woman trembling in the center of the room. Instead, Matteo wiped a bloodied knuckle and pulled Teresa against his chest. Teresa Marchetti was not the kind of woman dangerous men fought over in the dark, blood-stained alleys of Chicago. She was 26 years old, comfortably plump, and possessed a gentle softness that the brutal, unforgiving underworld usually chewed up and spat out without a second thought. Her thighs touched when she walked, her stomach had a soft, rounded curve, and she purposefully wore oversized drab wool sweaters to blend into the dismal gray background of the Chicago Freight Authority. She had spent her entire adult life trying to be invisible. But beneath that unassuming, plus-sized exterior lay a mind like a steel trap. Teresa was a master logistics analyst for the Midwest's largest port, and she saw every dirty secret hidden within the complex shipping manifests. She was the ghost in the machine, manipulating cargo routes and falsifying digital ledgers to keep her late father's insurmountable gambling debts from getting her family killed. For 3 terrifying years, Teresa had quietly skimmed off the top of the Stahl cartel, expertly diverting small fractions of their illegal weapons shipments and selling them back to neutral buyers on the black market just to stay afloat. She was careful, methodical, and brilliant. But Regina Stahl, the icy, sadistic matriarch of the German syndicate currently attempting a hostile takeover of the Chicago underworld, was finally catching on to the discrepancies. It was a bleak Tuesday evening in late November, the freezing rain violently lashing against the rusted corrugated metal of Warehouse 42, when Regina's enforcers finally tracked Teresa down. There were 4 of them, massive men with scarred knuckles, broken noses, and cold, dead eyes, reeking of cheap cologne and damp leather. They corralled her near the edge of the loading docks, the churning, icy waters of Lake Michigan roaring violently just below her feet. One of the thugs, a hulking man with a serpent tattoo snaking up his neck, laughed cruelly as he looked her up and down. He mocked her heavy coat, her full figure, calling her a slow, fat cow who had finally wandered into the slaughterhouse. He told her she was too heavy to run and too soft to fight back. Teresa did not scream. She did not beg for her life, even as tears of pure terror stung the corners of her eyes. Instead, she slowly reached into her deep coat pocket, her trembling fingers wrapping securely around the remote detonator she had hastily wired to the primary fuel line of Regina's prize smuggling vessel, docked just 20 yards away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hand remained incredibly steady. She knew the layout of this port better than anyone alive, and she knew the flash point of aviation fuel. She was a survivor, and she refused to die begging. Before Teresa could press the button and send them all to hell, the shadows at the far end of the warehouse seemed to detach and move forward. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the freezing docks, broken only by the rhythmic, deliberate click of expensive leather shoes against the wet concrete. Matteo Vitale stepped into the dim, flickering yellow light of the sodium lamps. I was the don of the Vitale Syndicate, the undisputed, terrifying king of the Chicago underworld. Tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and radiating an aura of absolute, unchecked violence, Matteo was a man who had carved his massive empire out of flesh and bone. His tailored black overcoat billowed slightly in the freezing wind. His dark, predatory eyes immediately locked onto Teresa. Taking in her terrified but defiant posture, the generous curve of her hips, the fullness of her lips, and the desperate, dangerous intelligence burning brightly in her gaze. He had been quietly watching her for months. He knew exactly who she was. He knew she was the phantom accountant, single-handedly messing with Regina Stahl's heavy supply lines, and he had been deeply, intensely fascinated by the sheer audacity of this soft, chubby woman outsmarting international terrorists from a dingy port cubicle. Matteo did not exchange a single word with Regina's enforcers. He simply stopped walking and raised his right hand. From the high rafters and the surrounding cargo containers, suppressed gunfire rained down like a sudden mechanical storm. The dull thwack of bullets hitting flesh echoed through the warehouse. The 4 heavily armed enforcers dropped to the concrete instantly, their blood rapidly mixing with the freezing rain and washing toward the edge of the dock. Teresa stumbled backward, her back hitting the freezing metal railing of the pier. She stared at the sudden massacre, her breath coming in ragged, visible white gasps. Matteo walked over the bleeding bodies as if they were nothing more than discarded trash on the street. He stopped mere inches from her, towering over her smaller, curvier frame, completely blocking out the harsh warehouse lights. He reached out slowly, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the soft line of her jaw. His touch was a shocking, burning contrast to the brutal carnage surrounding them. "You are a very difficult woman to track down. Teresa Marchetti," Matteo murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sent an involuntary shiver sliding down her spine. "You have cost the Stahl cartel $3 million in the last quarter alone. Regina wants your head delivered to her in a cardboard box." Teresa swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing pulse. She tilted her chin up to directly meet his dark, obsessive stare. "And what do you want, Mr. Vitale?" Matteo's gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly, appreciatively, roamed over the generous curves she always tried so hard to hide beneath her wet coat. A dangerous, completely possessive hunger flared in his dark eyes. "I want the brilliant mind that orchestrated this beautiful chaos," Matteo said softly. "And I want the magnificent woman who had the nerve to stand in front of 4 armed killers without flinching. You are coming with me." Teresa was immediately whisked away from the freezing docks to the Vitale estate, a sprawling, heavily fortified compound, hidden deep within the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of Lake Forest. For 2 nerve-wracking days, she was kept in a luxurious guest suite, treated not as a hostage, but as an honored queen. Her drab, oversized clothes were discarded by the estate staff, completely replaced by a stunning wardrobe of custom-tailored silk and velvet that perfectly hugged and accentuated every single curve she had spent her life desperately trying to hide. Matteo demanded she dine with him every single evening in his massive, dimly lit, formal dining room. He did not interrogate her about the port authorities or the missing ledgers. Instead, he asked about her life, her difficult childhood, and her complex thoughts, listening to her speak with an intense, unwavering focus that made Teresa feel both deeply exposed and entirely, completely safe. He was a ruthless monster to the outside world, a man who ordered executions with a flick of his wrist. But with Teresa, he was fiercely protective, almost worshipping the physical softness she had always viewed as a terrible flaw. On her first afternoon there, when she quietly mentioned that one of the perimeter guards had looked at her heavy thighs with obvious disdain. Matteo coldly had the man stripped of his rank and transferred to the most dangerous, violent outpost in the syndicate by midnight. No one was allowed to disrespect her, but the fragile, quiet bubble of the estate was rapidly about to burst. The time for underworld negotiations had come. The 5 families of the Midwest had called a mandatory neutral ground summit at the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago to officially address the rapidly escalating turf war between the Vitale Syndicate and the encroaching Stahl cartel. Matteo casually informed Teresa she would be attending the summit right by his side. Teresa stood before the massive, full-length mirror in her suite, staring at her reflection in total shock. She wore a deep emerald green velvet gown, specifically chosen by Matteo. The rich fabric clung tightly to her full breasts, cinched dramatically at her waist, and draped elegantly over her full hips and thick thighs. It was the most beautiful she had ever looked, yet terrible anxiety gnawed at her stomach. She was a harbor rat, an underground accountant who lived on microwave dinners, not a polished mafia princess. Matteo entered the room without knocking, stopping dead in his tracks the moment he saw her. The raw, unfiltered obsession in his eyes literally took her breath away. He stepped behind her, resting his large, warm hands firmly on her waist, pulling her back flush against his solid, muscular chest. "You are absolutely magnificent," he whispered roughly against her ear, pressing a hot kiss to the sensitive skin of her neck. "Tonight, you show all those vultures exactly who you are." The grand ballroom of the Palmer House. Hilton was a glittering den of vipers dressed in expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the smell of Cuban cigar smoke, vintage champagne, and heavy, unspoken threats. When Matteo entered the ballroom with Teresa proudly holding his arm, a dead hush fell over the massive room. Stunned whispers quickly broke out among the elite criminals. The notoriously ruthless Don Vitale, a solitary man who never brought women to business meetings, had just arrived with a beautiful plus-sized woman clinging to his side. Across the room, standing arrogantly by a grand piano, was Regina Stahl. She was terrifyingly thin, angular, and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, dressed in a stark, intimidating white suit. Her pale blue eyes locked immediately onto Teresa, and a cruel, knowing smile twisted her thin lips. Regina approached them slowly, her massive German bodyguards flanking her like hungry wolves. She stopped a few feet away, deliberately looking Teresa up and down with blatant, exaggerated disgust. "Matteo," Regina purred, her German accent thick and incredibly condescending. "I heard you were picking up stray dogs from the docks, but I did not realize your personal tastes had become so incredibly pedestrian. Or perhaps you are just stockpiling fat for the cold winter. Look at her. She does not belong in our elevated world. She is a heavy, pathetic little clerk who stole from the wrong people." The heavy tension in the ballroom snapped like a dry twig. Men instinctively reached inside their tailored jackets. The Vitale soldiers took a synchronized, threatening step forward. Matteo's handsome face turned to absolute stone, a lethal, quiet fury radiating from his rigid body. He moved to step between Teresa and Regina, fully ready to burn the fragile underworld truce to the ground right there in the ballroom. But Teresa stopped him. She placed a gentle but incredibly firm hand flat on Matteo's chest, stepping boldly around him to face the cartel boss directly. Her heart was pounding wildly, but the deep resilience that had kept her alive in the freezing, violent docks surged forward, masking her fear completely. "I might be a heavy clerk, Regina," Teresa said, her voice carrying clearly and calmly across the dead, silent ballroom. "But I am the exact clerk who noticed that your men forgot to bribe the overnight customs inspector at Pier 14 last week. I am the exact clerk who knows that your incoming multi-million-dollar shipment of automatic weapons is currently sitting in a federal holding unit in Gary, Indiana, because you stupidly mislabeled the cargo weights on the international manifest. You are losing Chicago, Regina, because you do not understand the intricate details. You only know how to kill people, not how to run a modern business." Regina's sharp face instantly drained of all color. The other syndicate bosses in the room began to murmur loudly, their carefully maintained respect for the Stahl cartel fracturing in real time. Teresa had just completely dismantled Regina's terrifying reputation with a few calm sentences, proving to every criminal in the room that she was infinitely more dangerous with a digital ledger than Regina was with an army of guns. Matteo looked down at Teresa, completely awestruck. The dark, possessive hunger that had been simmering in his chest suddenly exploded into something permanent and unshakable. He did not care about the truce anymore. He did not care about the other mob bosses watching them. He only cared about the brilliant, beautiful, fiercely brave woman standing proudly beside him. Regina, visibly shaking with absolute rage and humiliation, spat on the polished marble floor. "You think this fat pig will save your empire, Vitale? She is nothing. A temporary, disgusting plaything. You will send her back to the by tomorrow morning when you are bored of her." Matteo stepped forward. His dark presence was so overwhelmingly dominant and terrifying that Regina physically recoiled, stumbling back into her own guards. He did not pull a weapon. He did not need to. His voice was deathly quiet, yet it echoed with terrifying clarity in the cavernous room. "You will never speak to her again," Matteo said, his eyes black with a deadly promise. "If you look at her, I will take your eyes. If you breathe her name, I will cut out your tongue. She is not a plaything. She is my future." Matteo turned away from his enemy and looked down at Teresa, his hardened expression softening only for her. He reached out, weaving his strong fingers deep into her hair, cupping the back of her neck with a heavy, possessive grip. He completely ignored the shocked gasps of the wealthy onlookers, the furious glare of Regina Stahl, and the dozens of weapons drawn in the room around them. "You're sleeping beside me tonight," Matteo declared, his voice rough, heavy, and loud enough for the entire underworld to hear. Then the Mafia Boss kissed her before everyone. It was not a gentle, polite kiss. It was a searing brand. A public claim of absolute ownership, fierce protection, and unending devotion. He kissed her with a desperate, all-consuming heat, his mouth slanting hard over hers, tasting her initial shock and then her fiery, willing response. Teresa melted completely against him, her hands coming up to grip the silk lapels of his suit as he pulled her plush, curvy body flush against his hard, muscular frame. The devastating kiss silenced the entire room, echoing with the dramatic finality of a gunshot. Matteo Vitale had just declared a massive war, and he had permanently made Teresa Marchetti the undisputed queen of his bloody empire. The aftermath of the Palmer House Summit plunged Chicago into an immediate, bloody blackout. The fragile underworld truce did not just break, it completely disintegrated. by the time the sun rose over the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. The next morning, the Vitale Syndicate and the Stahl cartel were locked in an all-out, catastrophic war. Regina Stahl, humiliated and bleeding territory, lashed out with the unhinged desperation of a cornered animal. She ordered hits on Vitale supply chains across the Midwest, firebombed 2 neutral warehouses in Gary, Indiana, and put a staggering $10 million bounty on Teresa Marchetti's head. To Regina, Teresa was just a heavy, insolent clerk who needed to be slaughtered to restore the cartel's terrifying reputation. But Regina severely underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. Teresa did not cower in the luxurious, heavily guarded suites of the Lake Forest estate. While Matteo's massive enforcers prepared for a brutal street war, Teresa quietly walked into Matteo's private command center, a high-tech bunker hidden beneath the mansion. She took a seat at the main conference table, pulled a sleek silver laptop toward her, and went to work. She was a master of logistics, and war, at its core, was entirely about supply and demand. Over the next 48 hours, Teresa systematically and ruthlessly dismantled Regina Stahl's entire logistical infrastructure. Her plump, delicate fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed the Chicago Freight Authority's deepest encrypted servers. She rerouted Regina's incoming weapons shipments to federal lockups in Detroit. She froze the cartel's offshore shell companies by flagging their routing numbers to international banking regulators. She even intercepted Regina's encrypted communication network, feeding the cartel false coordinates that led 3 separate German hit squads directly into devastating Vitale ambushes. Matteo watched her work with a dark, consuming fascination. He had surrounded her with the deadliest killers in Chicago, ready to lay down their lives to protect her soft, curvy body, but Teresa was currently spilling more blood from a leather office chair than his men were on the streets. Every time she successfully choked out another one of Regina's revenue streams, Matteo would walk up behind her, bury his face in her dark hair, and praise her brilliant mind. He worshipped her intellect just as fiercely as he worshipped her physical form, constantly touching her waist, her thick thighs, her rounded hips, ensuring she knew that to him, she was the absolute pinnacle of perfection. But a wounded beast is the most dangerous, and Regina Stahl had one final desperate play. It happened on a Tuesday night during a blinding Midwestern blizzard. Matteo had been forced to leave the compound to personally oversee a massive retaliatory strike on Regina's secondary stronghold in Pilsen. He left Teresa with 20 of his best men, locking the estate down under maximum security protocols. Regina did not send street thugs this time. She sent an elite, phantom mercenary unit she had smuggled in from Berlin. Under the cover of the howling snowstorm, they bypassed the outer perimeter alarms by scaling the sheer, icy cliffs at the rear of the Lake Forest property. They silenced the perimeter guards with suppressed rifles and breached the main house before the internal alarms even triggered. Teresa was in the kitchen, wearing one of Matteo's oversized black button-down shirts that draped comfortably over her full curves, brewing a cup of chamomile tea when the power grid suddenly died. The massive mansion plunged into pitch darkness. Panic flared in her chest, but the cold, calculating survival instinct that had kept her alive on the docks instantly took over. She dropped the teacup, ignoring the shattering porcelain, and bolted toward the security bunker. The auxiliary emergency lights bathed the hallways in a sinister, pulsing red glow. Gunfire erupted in the east wing. The mercenaries were executing a sweeping, systematic breach, and they were looking specifically for her. Teresa reached the command center and locked the reinforced steel door behind her. 2 bleeding Vitale guards were already inside, trying desperately to reboot the jammed communication servers. Teresa pushed past them, immediately logging into the estate's localized smart grid. She could not call Matteo for help, but she controlled the house. Watching the thermal cameras on the backup monitors, Teresa saw 12 heavily armed mercenaries sweeping the main foyer. They were moving in a rigid, tactical diamond formation. Teresa's hands flew across the console. She was an analyst. She understood choke points, traffic flow, and containment. She began slamming heavy security blast doors throughout the mansion, intentionally herding the mercenaries away from the surviving guards and funneling them directly toward the estate's subterranean wine cellar. The mercenaries, thinking they were cornering their target, followed the open pathways she deliberately laid out for them. Once all 12 men crossed the threshold into the massive stone-walled cellar, Teresa executed a hard override. The titanium-reinforced doors slammed shut, locking the entire hit squad inside a windowless vault. She then accessed the estate's climate control systems, specifically the industrial halon gas fire suppression units located in the cellar. One of the bleeding guards looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. "You trapped them." Teresa's breathing was heavy, her soft chest rising and falling rapidly under the oversized shirt. She stared at the monitor, watching the mercenaries desperately try to blow the titanium door open with localized explosives, but the blast merely scorched the metal. "I did not just trap them," Teresa whispered, her voice remarkably steady. "I neutralized them." When Matteo returned to the estate an hour later, the driveway was filled with snow and blood. He tore through the front doors like a raging hurricane, his dark overcoat completely soaked in freezing rain and the blood of his enemies. I was utterly frantic, his terrifying, ruthless composure entirely shattered by the sheer terror of losing the woman who had become his entire world. He found Teresa sitting calmly in the red glow of the command center, a thick wool blanket wrapped securely around her generous curves. She was directing the surviving guards on how to safely vent the halon gas from the cellar before the authorities were called to clean up the bodies. Matteo fell to his knees in front of her chair. The most dangerous, feared man in Chicago buried his face in her soft stomach, his massive shoulders shaking as he wrapped his arms tightly around her thick thighs. He kissed her legs, her waist, her hands, treating her like a holy relic that had miraculously survived a fire. "You are safe," he choked out, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. "I swear on my soul, Teresa. I will burn the entire city to ash before I ever let anyone touch you." Teresa gently threaded her fingers through his dark, snow-dampened hair, holding the ruthless Mafia Boss against her breast. "You don't have to burn the city, Matteo," she said softly, a dangerous steel edge creeping into her gentle voice. "Because tomorrow, we are going to finish Regina Stahl together." The endgame was swift, merciless, and completely orchestrated by Teresa Marchetti. Regina Stahl had been flushed out of every safe house and warehouse in the state. Stripped of her money, her soldiers, and her international backing, the German syndicate leader retreated to her final remaining asset, a highly fortified, glass-walled penthouse perched 70 stories above the freezing, black waters of the Chicago River. It was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress, but Teresa had spent 3 years studying the cartel's architectural acquisitions. She knew the penthouse did not run on an independent grid. It was connected to the central municipal network. At exactly midnight, As a violent winter thunderstorm battered the skyscraper, Matteo Vitale stood in the private express elevator, checking the magazine of his customized handgun. Beside him stood Teresa. She was dressed in a tailored black wool trench coat that cinched beautifully at her waist, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek, severe braid. She held a heavily encrypted tablet in her hands. Matteo had tried to leave her behind at the estate, terrified of putting her in the line of fire again. But Teresa had refused. She had started this war from a dingy cubicle at the docks, and she was going to see it end. As the elevator silently rocketed past the 50th floor, Teresa tapped the final command into her tablet. She initiated a localized rolling blackout, completely killing the power to the top 10 floors of the skyscraper. The elevator bypassed the security checkpoints, gliding smoothly to the penthouse on a dedicated auxiliary line Teresa had quietly hijacked hours ago. The elevator doors opened into utter darkness. Matteo stepped out first, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of a predatory cat. The penthouse was in total chaos. Regina's remaining bodyguards were blinded, shouting in German and scrambling for tactical flashlights. They never stood a chance. Matteo and his 4 elite shadows moved through the sprawling, modern apartment, dispensing suppressed shots with chilling, mechanical precision. The brief flashes of muzzle fire illuminated the expensive modern art and the terrified faces of the dying guards. Teresa walked calmly behind Matteo, stepping carefully over the bleeding bodies, completely unfazed by the violence. She felt no pity for the men who had planned to throw her into Lake Michigan. They found Regina Stahl in the master office, desperately trying to open a wall safe hidden behind a painting. The German matriarch spun around as Matteo kicked the mahogany doors open. Regina looked pathetic. Her pristine white suit was wrinkled, her pale face gaunt and slick with panicked sweat. She raised a silver revolver, but Matteo shot her through the wrist before she could even disengage the safety. Regina screamed, collapsing to the polished hardwood floor, clutching her shattered, bleeding arm. Matteo walked forward and kicked the revolver across the room. He towered over the woman who had terrorized the Midwest, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. He did not say a word. He simply stepped aside, allowing Teresa to walk forward. Regina looked up, her blue eyes wide with agonizing pain and absolute disbelief. She stared at the beautiful, plus-sized woman she had so arrogantly dismissed as a temporary, fat plaything. Teresa stood above her, radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. Teresa looked down at the tablet in her hands, her expression completely indifferent. "You called me a pathetic clerk, Regina," Teresa said smoothly, her voice echoing in the dark, blood-spattered office. "But clerks are the ones who balance the ledgers, and your account is completely overdrawn." With one final tap on the glass screen, Teresa authorized a massive, irreversible digital transfer. The remaining $200 million, hidden in Regina's encrypted Cayman Island accounts, was instantly wiped clean, evenly dispersed into a dozen untraceable offshore charities. "You are nothing now," Teresa whispered, staring coldly into Regina's terrified eyes. "You are just a ghost." Matteo placed a heavy, reassuring hand on the small of Teresa's back. "Are you finished, my queen?" he asked softly, his tone completely different from the violent monster he presented to the world. Teresa nodded slowly, refusing to break eye contact with the broken cartel boss on the floor. "I am finished." Matteo guided Teresa out of the office, turning her back to the room before he raised his weapon one last time. A single muffled gunshot echoed through the penthouse, bringing a permanent, absolute silence to the brutal Chicago mob war. Hours later, back in the warm, absolute safety of the Lake Forest estate, Matteo carried Teresa into their massive master bedroom. The violent storm still raged outside, but inside there was only the quiet crackle of the marble fireplace. Matteo gently stripped away her heavy black coat, his dark eyes immediately softening with profound, unending adoration as he took in the lush, generous curves of her body. He pulled her down onto the massive four-poster bed, settling his heavy, muscular frame completely over her softer one. He worshipped every inch of her, his hands mapping the deep curve of her hips, the fullness of her stomach, the heavy weight of her breasts, pressing fervent, burning kisses into her flushed skin. He made love to her with a desperate, consuming passion, silently reinforcing that her body, her mind, and her soul were the most valuable things in his dark, violent universe. "You are the absolute ruler of this empire, Teresa," Matteo whispered raggedly against her swollen lips as they tangled together in the expensive silk sheets. "I merely enforce your will. You are the Empress of Chicago, and I belong entirely to you." Teresa pulled the ruthless Mafia Boss down for a deep, bruising kiss, her hands sinking firmly into his dark hair. She was no longer the invisible, plus-sized clerk hiding in the shadows of the docks. She was Teresa Vitale, the brilliant, beautiful mastermind who had brought the entire underworld to its knees, securely ruling it, all right beside the lethal devoted king who loved every single soft curve she possessed. Did you love the intense romance and high-stakes mafia drama in this story? If you want gripping underworld tales, where brilliant, beautifully real women conquer ruthless syndicates and claim their dark kings, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment between Matteo and Teresa, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story.